think, from looking at the molecular level up to the Gulf wide. And this is what we tried to do as part of the Geyser consortium, which consisted of over 20 people spread from Hawaii to Cardiff in Wales, split into 4 rough groups, which you obviously can't read. The vision was basically to look at all these scales to predict the fundamental behavior and understand it of petroleum fluids in the ocean environment. And so we wanted to work on multiple scale modeling systems which were validated by field and laboratory experiments. And so that you could get a spill such as Deepwater Horizon and then track where the oil was going to go. And essentially this was the modeling system we had. It's really divided into 2 parts. The lower part is what goes on within the water column, bearing in mind that this was the first ever deep water spill experienced by the industry. And then once it gets up to the surface, of course, you have a whole different range of models that you need to bring into play to take account of the different scales of motion of the oil. And I'm going to try and give some of the more interesting results from this. Obviously, as everybody else has said, it's impossible to do justice to 3 years of work by 50 people or so in 15 minutes, but we'll try. He's been funded not only through GOMRI, but also through the API to do some work at looking at how oil droplets behave in the lab. And what he did was he was looking at oil blended with dispersant to see how temperature affects this, because this is obviously something you want to know, and using a particular dispersant oil ratio, he could show that as you change the temperature, so you get different sized oil droplets from adding dispersant. And one of the interesting things that he said was that as you get up to 45 degrees, which, okay, it's not a temperature that we find particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, but we do find it, or temperatures in that range in the Persian Gulf area, maybe dispersants aren't quite as effective as they seem to be at lower temperatures. Anyway, so other sorts of work we had. Scott Sokolowski, for instance, has been doing a lot of work trying to differentiate between what happens in situations where you have stratification and cross-flow. And in the upper 2 panels here, you can see what a plume looks like under either purely stratified conditions or pure cross-flow conditions. And you can see that if you just have stratification, the plume comes up from a source and tends to spread out along the stratified interface. If you put it into pure cross-flow, and this is a mixed plume of bubbles and a dye, you can see that there is separation. If you combine the 2, depending on whether it's weak or strong cross-flow, you can get different patterns produced. And essentially what happens is that the combination of gas and the dye, or maybe oil droplets, rises up above the level of neutral density and then comes back down again. And this occurs whether or not you do it from the bottom up or from the top down. And if this one will work, no, I don't want to work my videos. Anyway.
You described them very well, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, I apologize for this. They all work fine in the machine outside. This one, obviously, it may be a Mac PC thing, I don't know. But what happens, Eric Adams, for instance, at MIT and his group, they were working on using very small glass beads as analogues of oil droplets. And in fact, you know, obviously glass is denser than water, so they started at the top and put them down into the water. But they found exactly the same sort of thing that Scott found in his lab, in that you get an overshoot when you have these glass beads mixed in with dye. The dye overshoots and then comes back up in the water column. So this factor that you're overshooting a neutral density level occurs whichever way you operate, and it's due to this combination of stratification and crossflow. We also went out and did some field work, again using the Nautilus, and I have to echo what's been said before, that they do a really great job of outreach, that group. We have the looking at some of the actual seeps in the Gulf. What happens there is that because if they're particularly deep, even if they're just gas seeps, they're below the level at which you can get methane hydrate formation. And this tends to form skins on the surfaces of the bubbles which change the way the bubbles behave. This is a picture of the confetti seep. You can see that you don't have nice spherical oil bubbles, which is what you would expect. They're sort of pancake shaped, and this is because of this skin that forms on top of them and changes completely the way they move in the water column. As part of this, we also managed to use acoustic methodologies to look at how far we could actually trace these gas bubble plumes. And you can see here a still photograph of the gas bubble plume from the seep on the previous slide. This is from Chip Breyer at Woods Hole. He's using acoustics. You can trace these gas bubbles up in the water column until they disappear. And that's when they've dissolved. As was found after the spill, none of the vast quantities of methane that were released during the Deepwater Horizon, or very small amounts of it, made it up as far as the surface. Most of it dissolved, and John Kessler did a lot of work on this early on following the immediate spill scenarios. Now, when we get into the lab, or rather, when we get into models, this, as has been said, the finer the scale, and again, this one presumably won't work. No, doesn't want to work at all. Oh, well, whatever. You're looking at very, very fine scales over very short time periods, and that means very, very intense computational requirements. Torsten Stosser was looking at this using MPI methods. I'm not a modeler, so I can't really explain this too well, but other members of my group are. And this was one of the things we were looking at, how these models actually reproduce the patterns by which molecules of oil and oil droplets work, or how they're affected by the ocean. And of course, you have to go out into the ocean as well to ensure what you're doing is correct. And so one of the things we did, because this was the first deep water spill, was we had a tracer release experiment run by Jim Ledwell. He's run a number of these throughout the globe, and he put an anthropogenic tracer in at 1,200 meters to see if he could mimic what happened with the subsurface plume and how quickly it would be mixed into the water column and throughout the Gulf of Mexico. Obviously, you need some other ground truthing as well, so we had a whole series of mooring observations around this. The physical oceanographers know very well that there's a big separation at about 900 meters in the Gulf of Mexico because that is the outflow depth of Florida Strait. And if you look at the current meter records, you can see that, in fact, while the surface layer can act in a fairly coherent way, what goes on down below bears very little resemblance to what's happening in the upper 900 meters. Now, This was the map that we got from the tracer after a year. It was put in just southwest of the original site. The dots show where Jim Ledwell went out and sampled. The red was where the tracer should have been according to the model that Roy Ying He and his group produced. And while, yes, there is some similarity, there are also areas, for instance, in the southwestern Gulf, where the oil should, or the tracer should have got to, but Jim couldn't find any. This lack of reproducibility between models and data is one of the factors which really annoys oceanographers. Joe Reed, I remember, got the Albatross Award many years ago for daring to suggest that models and data should actually have some correspondence. But you know, it's an ongoing problem, and it occurs at all scales. Okay. Now, what I wanted to show you was the fact that we said we were going to set up a nested set of models that would, you know, be able to work across these different scales. And we've done that. And this is actually the wrong version of my talk. I reloaded it yesterday, and this isn't the right one. But if anybody's interested, I can show you later during the meeting exactly what we have done and how we can get, using particle tracers, to get particles to shift across between different domains driven by different models at very different scales, going from the open Gulf of Mexico at a scale, you know, at scales of 5 kilometers or so, onto the shelf at a scale of 1 kilometer, and then into the bays. Because the big problem with the Gulf of Mexico is that it's surrounded by very shallow bays which have very complex patterns of current movement due to the fact both that they're shallow and B, the fact that they have these deep water channels that have been cut to allow shipping to move in and out. And so we have these 3 different models that are all nested. They all operate at different scales from kilometers down to about 10 meters, and multiple depth levels, and we can now do what we said we were going to do, which is shift particles between these models and get reasonable, what we think are reasonable looking results. Well, this one works. This is the Oliver Fringer's model of Galveston Bay. It's essentially showing you how the tide varies, and you can see that even in an area like Galveston Bay, you're getting fairly complicated patterns produced in the model. Okay, so what are the major gaps? Where do we go from here? Well, as I've said, models and data don't always agree. We still need to work on that. We still need more information on how bubbles behave and how hydrate shell formation affects them. We don't know how long the plume lasts and how far it can move. This is something that, if there is another spill, we would obviously want to concentrate on. Hopefully there won't be. So where are we going? We've designed a suite of models that does describe the fate of an oil drop on scales from droplet size to the full basin scale. We've done lab experiments to verify smaller scale changes. We've completed field work to quantify mixing rates and allow us to scale the results up. And we've shown we can identify and follow plumes acoustically. And, well, how do we use our results? What's the important thing? Well, they're already being used. The Texas General Land Office already uses our models for slick forecasting. When the oil spill in Galveston Bay occurred last year, the Bayes model came in very useful there, and it was used to help predict where the oil was going to go. And we see that the model suite we've got, as I'm sure all the other groups do, we think that their results will be used to help in future spills anywhere in the world. We feel exactly the same about our model suite. It could be used anywhere else in the world. And I want to thank Gomri on the research board for allowing us to get this far. Thank you.